All right. We left off starting to talk about the environment, hearing in the environment, and we were talking about cues in which we use to do sound localization. And we left off talking about intraoral time cues. So time cues are not dependent on frequency. That's important. Okay? And they use this intricate circuitry of the superior olivary nucleus in order to detect very, very small differences in time, up to 10 microsecond differences in the time that a sound strikes each of our ears. Okay? And so, we already covered this, but to go back over it, quick things not working. When a sound comes in, and in this case, strikes both of our ears at the same time, right? That sound starts in the right and the left auditory nerve, and it starts coming in and hitting these neurons in the superior olivary nucleus, but it's only when those signals coincide, when they reach a neuron at the same time, that neuron then fires its signal. So in this case, it hit both ears at the same time, so it coincided at 0 degrees, right? But if it were to hit the left ear first, that signal would start moving through the pathway and would travel further through the ear that it hits first, right? So that it actually ends up over here on the right side of the slide, where it's going to coincide with the signal coming in from the right auditory nerve and signal that, yes, that came in to 10 degrees left as opposed to dead center or to the right. Good? All right. So we now have two other ways in which we can detect sound that are frequency specific. One for low frequencies and one for high frequencies. And so because of the size of our head, and because our heads are typically all about the same size, it takes about 600 microseconds for sound, if it's directly perpendicular to us, 90 degrees to us, to travel around our head. And so, because of this, there are two different characteristics that happen. One is called phase differences, and one is called intensity differences. So in terms of intensity, for high frequency sounds, the head creates an acoustic shadow, if you will. It absorbs some of the sound waves. And so the sound reaching our second ear for high frequency sounds is slightly less intense than the sound reaching the first ear. So the second ear receives a slightly lower intensity, and this only works for high frequency wavelengths because of the compression of air at higher frequency gets disrupted by the head. Lower frequencies don't get disrupted, and so this doesn't work for low frequency sounds. It only works for higher frequency sounds. So low frequency waves are not as disrupted by something like our head, right? So you can see here how the ripples of low frequency waves become distorted, high frequency waves get distorted, but low frequency waves don't. We can actually measure this if you put a microphone in the ear canal. You can measure the acoustic shadow, the differences in intensity here. And so here we see for lower frequency sounds, there's no difference or very little difference for 250 and 1,000. But by the time we get to 5,000 and 10,000 hertz, when we're at 90 degrees, that's our maximal acoustic shadow, we get a pretty significant difference in decibels. 45 degrees, you can see the difference there. All right, so what about low frequency sounds? Well, low frequency sounds actually reach, because again, sound waves are compressions of air. So at the peak, if we think about it as that sine wave, right, at the peak of the sine wave, the molecules are closer together. We have rarefaction, we have molecules further apart at the base. And so our eardrum can actually detect if it's being pushed in or pulled out by that sound wave for low frequency sounds. So we can actually detect phase differences for low frequency sounds. And so this doesn't become good for high frequency sounds, because if that wave can travel through a whole cycle before it gets to the other side of the head, then if it's in a different phase, it doesn't tell us anything, right? But for low frequency sounds, we're able to then detect that. All right. So it's most effective if it's within a single wavelength of less than 600 microseconds to go through. And I mean, and obviously that matters if it's not directly to 90 degrees, right? If we're less of an angle there. So the size of the head then matters. And so if we think about other species like mice, we talked about mice having a different range of sensitivity in terms of the frequencies that they could detect, and there was much higher frequencies. Part of that is that they don't have the size of head in order to localize sounds with very low frequencies. And they're much better at localizing high frequencies because the size of their head is so much smaller. Then they can have a single wavelength of a much higher frequency be localized by phase differences. Elephants have very large heads. That helps with that very low, less than 20 hertz frequency detection. That helps them localize sound of the very low frequencies. All right, so why do we care about this? There are some applications for this, and newer technology has allowed for things like for people that are blind to have auditory localization maps, if you will, to help them navigate the environment. And so they can hear where things are through manipulating these intensity delays. And you experience this when you are watching a movie and in home theater with surround speakers. The auditory signals there are being manipulated in terms of the delay between the two speakers that are playing in order to move the sound from the left to the right side of the screen, just like is happening in this case, right? All right. We talked a little bit about the fact that our antennae are responsible for helping us do elevation detection. And so depending on where the sound is, the spectrum, the frequency, the intensity of that sound across frequencies differs depending on elevation based on the fact of the shape of our antenna. And we call this directional transfer function, DTF. And so at 0 degrees, at the same level as your head, across the frequencies from low frequency to high frequency, there's a particular pattern of intensity that our pinna creates. And as that sound then moves higher or lower in elevation, it changes that pattern of intensity in a specific way that our brain has recognized as differences in elevation. And again, if we smooth out the pinna, if we eliminate this structure, then this goes away, and we remove the ability to detect that change in elevation. So it's actually a pretty complex processing that happens, right? Where we're able to tell that this pattern of changes in intensity across frequency is related to something being higher up in the air compared to 0 degrees or lower. And then our last sort of sound localization cue is distance cues. How far away is the sound from us? And so sound level is one way we know that. If we are familiar with the sound and we're familiar with how loud that sound should be, then changes in intensity can help us understand how far away that sound is. That's only good for things that we know are at like relatively constant levels. Right? Relatively constant levels of sound. Just like we talked about with vision, that the further away something is, we get atmospheric perspective, so that the lower wavelengths, the blue wavelengths of light, get scattered more the further away something is. The same thing happens with frequency. So the atmosphere absorbs sound as it moves through it. And that, again, just like the acoustic shadow, just like we talked about with intensity differences with localization, the same thing happens with the atmosphere, that it affects high frequencies more than low frequencies. And so sounds that are further away tend to have more low frequency sounds and less high frequency components to it, right? So if you hear the loudspeaker at the stadium, right, that's playing, and you're in your dorm room across campus, you tend to hear the low frequency sounds of that. It's harder to hear the higher frequency sounds. You hear all of the bass coming from that and not the high frequency. And then we also have acoustic what am I trying to say? We have, I'm blanking on the word, acoustic cues of indirect versus direct sounds. So how sound bounces off of things, and we'll talk about acoustic architecture and how sound moves within rooms, that the further away a sound is, the more indirect sound you receive and the less direct sound that you receive. And just like with vision, we talked about motion parallax. So who remembers what motion parallax was? For vision. Yeah, Jay.
Like objects closer to the right move faster than objects farther away.
Yeah, so when you're looking out the window of the car as you're going down the road, the farmhouse in the distance is moving really slowly, but everything next to the road is moving really fast. The same thing happens with sound. Right? So sounds that are closer to us change faster than sounds that are far away. All right. And that leads us to talking about the Doppler shift. So the Doppler shift is changes in the pitch of a sound. So if we you are standing on the side of the highway and you have a car that's coming towards you. It's better for these scenes that are sort of like this. So you can really hear it right there, that as a fast-moving object moves towards us, the frequencies in front of that object are actually getting bunched up because the object is moving. Inside that car, it's the engine's making the same sound, right? So the driver inside the car hears the same sound. But to an observer, as that car is approaching, the frequencies are, whoops, yeah, okay, sound effects. All right, so as that car is approaching, the sound in front of the car is actually getting bunched up closer, and the sound behind the car is, because it's moving, the frequencies are actually further apart. And so we can hear this difference in this Doppler shift. The frequencies in front of the car are a higher pitch, and as the car goes by, it then shifts to a lower pitch. And if you have something that's moving faster than the speed of sound, right? If you have something like a jet, a jet airplane that's moving faster than the speed of sound, it actually moves ahead of this, and all of these frequencies then in front of it get bunched up together and become what we call a sonic boom. And when that jet goes by, there's this loud explosion of frequencies that are all bunched up together, and then you have the trailing edge of those frequencies. All right. So how is the auditory cortex organized? How do we talk about the primary auditory cortex being organized? Tonotopically, right? It's organized so that we can detect what frequencies are present. Because that's sort of the primary job of the auditory system, is particularly with communication, is to understand what frequencies are present so that we can recognize the patterns of the frequencies and understand what the sounds mean. It's not organized primarily for our ability to detect where sounds are coming from. Right? So we have to have special processing, like the superior olivary nucleus, that's going to generate a labeled line output that's going to go up and allow us to know interoral time differences, right? Or intensity differences for high frequency or phase differences in order to detect that. So while frequency is important, auditory localization is also important, but our brain has to do that. Our physiology is not set up to do that. We have to do that through a discrete processing system. Right? And we know that parts of the auditory cortex and the secondary auditory cortex in particular are involved with the sound localization. If we remove those areas from animals, then they lose the ability to detect where sounds are coming from. So we know this from lesioning studies. There are neurons that are tuned for specific interoral time differences. So there are neurons receiving that labeled line input from the superior olivary nucleus. But there's some convergence of that as well. And so we end up having these neurons that respond to areas out in our environment. It's not just like a 1 degree from left neuron and 10 degree from left. That's the way the superior olivary nucleus codes it, but by the time it gets to the auditory cortex, we have these groups of neurons converging to form a map, if you will, sort of a spatial map of where sounds are in the environment. And they code both location, but they're also incorporating those distance cues as well. So it's a spatial map of where and how far away those cues are. So here, if we look at one of these neurons that's coding for that, we see that it has a tuning curve, just like we see with frequency in the auditory cortex, but now these localization neurons have tuning curves that are most sensitive to a certain place, and as we move away from, so this place would be slightly to the right of the head, and as we move away from that place, the tuning curve goes down. And it's organized in columns, again, so that all the neurons in that column respond to that same place in space. And as we move over to another column, we're moving over to a different place in space. Particularly in the right hemisphere is where a lot of this is happening. So when we talk about, we'll talk next week, next Tuesday, about speech, and we'll talk about the complex processing of language that happens in the left hemisphere. A lot of this stuff is what's going on in the right hemisphere, in the non-primary auditory cortex, the secondary cortex of the right hemisphere. So when we say the right hemisphere responds to environmental sounds, it's responding to not just non-language sounds, but also to these cues to help us localize where sounds are coming from. And in this case, the movement of sounds. So here we see another neuron that is selectively tuned to movement in from the left to the right, but does not fire very much when movement is going from the right to the left. So we have movement-specific neurons that we find in particularly in the non-primary or secondary cortex. So the NP means non-primary. That would be our auditory cortex of the right hemisphere. So primary auditory cortex, tonotopically organized, very important in detecting frequencies, but then we dedicate this processing power, particularly in the right hemisphere, in the secondary areas of auditory processing, to helping us identify where in space sounds are and how they're moving, how they're changing. There are, so far I've talked about sort of labeled line neurons, right? So when we talk about a neuron that has a tuning curve for a particular place in space, that's a labeled line. It only fires for a particular signal. But there are also neurons that receive divergence of those labeled lines that are that show across fiber pattern firing. So, and those neurons are called panoramic neurons. And so here we see, if it's kind of weird how this is organized, but if you think about each of these blocks as a point in time, right? We see different patterns of action potentials. So that first one, we're typically looking at this like, right, 2 neurons, and the second one over here would be 2 spikes further apart, and that second one would be a different pattern like that. So looking from 0 to -60 to -20, we would have a pattern like this, right? Where the firing pattern of that neuron is going to represent where in space that sound is coming from. And different species have different abilities to detect sounds. And so, for instance, birds that are hunting for prey have very good both not just visual but auditory localization in order to hear where, like an owl, for instance, a barn owl has a very specialized auditory system that allows it to hear where a mouse is and be able to detect that through localization of these specialized areas in the brain. All right, so talking about this indirect versus direct sound auditory cues. And so sound can travel directly to our ears, but it's also bouncing off of these walls, off of the ceiling. It's being absorbed by objects in the room, and so our acoustic environment matters in terms of what sounds sound like. So we have direct sound in both of these cases, but in the fact that in the instance where the person playing guitar is sitting outside, there's less indirect sound as opposed to within an enclosed room where we're going to get sound that's bouncing off of the walls, and that matters. That makes a difference. So the amount of direct and indirect sound is influenced by distance. So we talked about that with as a cue to tell how far away a particular sound is. But it's also influenced by the environment. And so we can use, by understanding this, we can engineer environments with acoustic engineering in order to maximize the quality of the sound that's in that room.
So can we please answer my original question? Why does it sound different when we speak outside than inside?
Put on your headphones so that this demonstration isn't contaminated by the uncontrolled character of the room you're sitting in. Alright. Imagine a scenario with a source and receiver outside, in a free field with no reflecting surfaces nearby. It would sound something like this.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Now, put a few walls in.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Now enclose it totally.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Can we play those again?
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters. In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters. In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
We can watch the sound move through these enclosure conditions using ray tracing. We'll use the ray, or line, model to represent sound. Though it omits the frequency differences and multi-directionality content of sound, this is good for showing propagation and reflection. Starting with the free field, we can model the paths the sound takes from the source to the receiver.
That's it. I mean, just a straight shot?
Yeah, the free field is an anechoic environment.
Wait. What?
Without an echo.
Ah, okay, I get it.
In the absence of reflecting surfaces, the direct sound is the only kind of sound arriving at the listener. It arrives at the listener sometime after the source creates it, the delay pursuant to the distance between the source and the receiver. And with a single surface added, say the ground plane in an outdoor environment, we see the direct sound followed by the reflected sound off the plane. Adding a second reflective surface, we see the direct sound followed by reflections off the floor and wall. They've arrived later than the direct sound because they've traveled farther.
Right, because the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line.
Right, so the reflected sound arrives later than the direct sound. Also, some of the sound energy has been lost to the surfaces, sound transmission through the material, and sound absorption in the material. So the reflected sounds not only arrive later, but weaker. The sound has undergone the twin phenomenon of time and attenuation. In this case, we've chosen smooth concrete as our simulated surfaces, so only a tiny portion of the sound impinging on those surfaces is either lost to transmission or absorption. Almost everything, then, is reflected.
Yeah, 98%. So 2 surfaces begets 2 reflections.
No. We've only looked at the one bounce reflections, called first-order reflections. There are reflection paths that include more than one surface. Well, let's look at second-order reflection.
Well, that arrives later than the first order reflections, because it's traveled farther, and is weaker than the first order reflections because it's hit two surfaces instead of one.
In this case, yes. On average, higher order reflections are weaker and arrive later than first order reflections. When taken in aggregate, this is how indoor sound lingers for just a bit. Just enough that you can sense it, then fades.
In some rooms, it lingers longer than just a bit. I wanted to see how complicated it gets with total enclosure.
It's complicated, but not very complex. If you can follow the concept behind the partially enclosed room, you can follow the concept behind the fully enclosed room. There are just orders of magnitude more paths for sound to take and still arrive at the receiver loud enough to be audible. We can start with the first order reflections. Then, higher multi-order reflections until the sound level of the reflections, weakened by successive impacts on the surfaces that absorb sound, is either below the noise floor in the room or below the threshold of hearing altogether.
So that's why you hear that echo, right?
With the source and receiver outside in a free field.
Words can be written, many words can be written with a small set
So
of letters.
when you hear this sound,
Now enclose it totally.
In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Can we play those again?
so that is the second order reflections, right? Where we have sound waves that are bouncing now within an enclosed room that are indirect sounds that are reaching our ears microseconds behind the primary sound and adding that depth, that echo almost, that reverb is what we call it, right, to that sound. And in fact, because we have this indirect sound that's happening, that's occurring, our brain actually filters out indirect sounds so that we can identify or hear the primary sounds, and it doesn't interfere with those primary sounds. And this is called the precedence effect. So, for instance, if we have two speakers, right? And again, this is the way that your TV speakers or your home theater speakers work, right? To move sound from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. If those sounds are simultaneous from the left and right speaker, our perception is that that sound is coming from the center, right? Because things like our superior olivary nucleus are being stimulated at the same time. The left and the right ear, the sound's reaching them at the same time. Right? As we now have delays and we now move that sound, we have the sound coming from the right speaker before the left speaker, very short delays, we're now moving the perception of where that sound is originating towards that speaker. And it turns out that if we have a delay that's long enough, we hear two sounds. We hear the original sound and then we hear the echo, we hear the second sound. But there's a point in between those where it's not loud enough for an echo, that our brain does what's called the precedence effect, where it suppresses the indirect sound so that it doesn't interfere. And when that happens, we get fusion, where between like 1 to 5 milliseconds, we're suppressing that indirect sound, and we only hear sound from the primary pathway. If we're longer than 5 milliseconds, then it exceeds our brain's ability to suppress that, and we hear the echo. We detect two sounds. And so we can measure this threshold for fusion of the sound in terms of moving the sound from left to right versus the precedence effect where we only hear it from one ear because our brain is suppressing those indirect sounds so we don't get confused by them. All right, so far we've sort of focused on a single source of sound, but our normal auditory environment is not usually where we have just one sound. We're often in a crowded area, well, we used to be, right? But we're often in a place where multiple sounds are happening, and you have to fixate on a particular source of sound in order to stay engaged in that conversation, right? And so our brain is also doing this very complex processing called auditory stream segregation, where it is identifying which frequencies are important to pay attention to and highlighting those, if you will, almost like we talk about sort of lateral inhibition in the visual system, where we're honing in on the frequencies that we're trying to pay attention to, so that we're able to pay attention and hear sounds in a very complex auditory environment, right? So if you think about with vision, if you're trying to pay attention to something with vision, then you focus that in your center of vision. With the auditory system, again, it's not set up to localize sounds, and so all of these frequencies are hitting our eardrum and hitting our cochlea at the same time, and so we have to use the processing power of the brain in order to isolate which frequencies are most important for us to pay attention to. All right, so these are two different concert halls, the Boston Symphony Hall and a concert hall in Amsterdam, and we see that they have manipulated that environment in ways to change the amount of direct and indirect sound to create a good acoustic perception for the people that are in those theaters. So we see these unusual shapes here. We see again some of these coffers and these other beams along the walls here are breaking up that sound in a way to disrupt it so that we don't hear the reverb, the indirect sounds as much. So indirect sound is influenced by the type of environment that we're in, right? And so here, if you're in a concert hall and someone's talking behind you, you're hearing that direct sound that's interfering with your ability to hear the ambient sound that's coming in the room. So this is another short video that explains how we can manipulate the acoustic environment in order to change the way in which those indirect sounds reach our ears.
I'm John Calder of Acoustic Geometry. Let's talk about acoustics, which is basically how sound works in rooms. It may seem complicated, so let's make it simple. Most rooms have flat walls and flat ceilings, and sound bounces off of these. So how does that affect the sound? I'll use these two Nerf guns to demonstrate. I've got this one aimed so this disc goes directly to the ear. That represents direct sound. I've got this one aimed so that disc bounces off the wall and it represents reflected sound. I'll shoot them both at the same time. Reflected sound arrives at our ears later than direct sound, even though it started out at the same time, because it's traveling farther. And this wall is only one flat surface. There are at least 6 in the average room, and that's a lot of reflected sound. But why is reflected sound bad? I'll demonstrate using these two identical patterns. The blue pattern represents direct sound waves, and the red pattern represents reflected sound waves. They start out together, but when I move the red one backwards, like a delayed sound reflection, it creates destructive interference patterns, which changes the original sound wave. Here's the problem. Original sound waves are distorted by strong, later arriving reflections. Also, sound travels really fast, about 1,130 feet per second. A sound wave will bounce back and forth between these two walls about 60 times in 1 second. Sound travels so fast, it fills a room almost instantly. And this is only one bounce angle. Every room has thousands. How can we make our rooms sound better? Remember our Nerf guns? I'll shoot these at the same time, again representing a sound wave bouncing off a wall. Both discs bounce together in the same direction, which means the reflected sound is at full strength. Now let's use the first of our two acoustical tools, an absorber, to reduce the strength of sound bounces. To a sound wave, an absorber looks a little like a hole in the wall, so some of the energy doesn't come back. An absorber works by reducing the strength of reflected sound that would otherwise cause more destructive interference. But if we use only absorbers in a room, it makes it sound dull and unnatural. Historically, humans don't like overly absorbent rooms. So, let's use the second of our two acoustical tools, the curved surface diffuser. It also reduces the strength of sound bounces. A diffuser works by scattering the sound reflections in different directions, smoothing out destructive interferences throughout the room. Room acoustics are greatly improved using a combination of absorption and diffusion.
So you can hear the difference when they put the diffusers.
It's all about reducing those flat surface reflections. Use a combination of absorbers and diffusers, and your room will sound a lot more natural. Thanks for watching.
So that's a great example of how
room acoustics are greatly improved of absorption and diffusion.
So when he's in the room where we're having lots of reflected sound, we're getting lots of indirect sound, and when he puts the diffusers and the absorbers in there, it becomes much more natural sounding because we're eliminating the reverb that's happening. All right, so there are four qualities that define the properties of a room, that define the acoustic properties of a room. The first is the amount and the duration of indirect sounds. And 2 seconds is about the maximum that you can have in a large, like auditorium-like area before you start to have that echo effect. Okay? So if it's too long, if the reverb time is too long, then the sound becomes muddy, right? It has that. We have too many of the indirect frequencies interfering with the direct frequencies. And if it's too short, then it sounds not as full and rich because we don't get this sort of perspective when we think of like the harmonics of the primary sounds that are being produced. The time between the first direct sound and the first indirect sound is called intimacy time. It's how close you are to that sound. And so if you're sitting in the front row of Leonard Auditorium for a choral concert, or if you're sitting in the back row, that's going to affect the quality of the sound that's hitting your ears, the proportion of direct versus indirect sound. Also, because low frequency sounds are not affected as much by these acoustic properties, they're not absorbed or interfered with, we tend to get more bass. So the bass ratio changes depending on how much of that high frequency sounds are being absorbed versus being reflected. And then finally, the sort of how large the enclosed area is matters in terms of the fraction of sound that is indirect versus not direct. Right? So when you're singing in the shower, right, and you think your voice sounds really good, you're in a small, enclosed, hard surface area producing lots of indirect sound, and that is changing the way in which you hear your voice. All right. So everything we've been talking about is sort of getting at this ecological approach. So just like we talked about with vision, we talked about J.J. Gibson's approach to where he was trying to get out of the laboratory and understand, for his case, particularly how pilots land airplanes in terms of understanding visual cues. We have Gaver, who spent a lot of time trying to understand how do we do this auditory segregation. It's really important processing, very complex processing. How do we pay attention? How does our brain, what heuristics does our brain use in order to identify sounds and segregate them into certain pathways? And he came up with a whole list of heuristics that we use in order to do this. So, let me see if I can. All right, so tell me if you can identify what this sound is. Whoops. That's not what I'm trying to do. Why this sound is so loud. I guess that's as loud as I can get it. Let me see. Oh, here we go. So how can you identify if that's running up or downstairs? How many people think up? How many people think down? One more time. Up or down? Up, right? What about that one? And so that's running downstairs. So we can identify lots of properties of sounds based on the characteristics of how those frequencies are changing, right? So running up and down stairs, the way that the sounds are created, we have learned, we've encoded through heuristics to process those things so that we understand, so that we have an association with that. We can even detect gender differences, right? So the way that men and women walk have a different sound, and we have learned through experience. And again, all this is very subconscious exposure, heuristics sort of learning. What about these sounds? Let's see. Can you tell what those sounds are? What? Bowling? What about this? A what? A vending machine? Okay, good guess. An elevator? Right? And so you guys are hearing sounds that you're associating heuristics with rolling, closing, right? These are actions that your brain is interpreting based on these sounds. And it is, sometimes we make mistakes, right? Where you think, oh, well that's a vending machine, or that's an elevator, when it's actually a filing cabinet closing, right? And if I say that and then play it again, that top-down influence now becomes really kind of clear. If you know that, that's what, if you're expecting what that sound is supposed to be, right? All right, so again, all of this is based on heuristics that get encoded through our natural exposure in the environment to these sounds. That's all of this sort of subconscious learning that's happening, these associations between changes in sound frequencies that become associated with actions of objects. All right. So, ways in which we can sort of do this auditory segregation that Gabber came up with is that, one, we can use location and our ability to isolate sounds from different places in order to focus in on particular ones. And so if you think about going to hear an orchestra playing in Leonard Auditorium, the fact that the strings are on the left side of the stage and the horns are on the right side of the stage helps us, even though all that sound is reaching our ears at the same time, helps us isolate and localize those sounds to the particular instrument that they're coming from. The timbre that we talked about with instruments, the onset and offset of sounds, helps us segregate them to a particular thing, right? So if you're in that crowded scene and you're having a conversation with your friend, the fact that those frequencies from your friend's mouth as you're watching their mouth move sync up with the start and stop of those sounds as opposed to other people's conversations around you helps you isolate and focus on that auditory stream, right? Timbre, as I mentioned, this idea that we have particular harmonic frequencies associated with particular instruments, with particular voices, right? So that we can focus on a single voice as opposed to other voices that are in the room. Using timbre helps. And then pitches with similar frequencies are also associated as coming from a common source, which I think is what this is. So if you listen to that and you try to segregate out those streams, you kind of hear two separate things that are playing, right? You have a high frequency stream and you have a low frequency stream. Even though those notes are being played alternatively in time, it's like a high note, low note, high note, low note, our brain is able to segregate those streams into the frequencies that are close together and the frequencies that are higher apart. So this is what's actually being played there. And you hear this high frequency, dun, 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 and you hear it keep going up. And we're segregating, we're breaking that because of the commonality of the frequencies into that low stream and that high stream. All right, so sounds that occur in close together can also be grouped together. It's just going to break all together. It's not working for me. All right. We will try again. guess I should have moved those further apart. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to just skip that one since this is not going to work for me. So anyway, we have I apologize, this is very frustrating. Okay, so if I were able to play those sounds, as we have two sounds that come together and then separate apart, what we end up hearing is the sounds meeting and then coming back up as opposed to crossing over and going back down. So we actually, and this is segregated by right and left speaker, which is hard to hear in here, where the right side is doing this, and the left side is doing the bottom. But we segregate that out based on frequency. So that's good continuation. It's sort of similar to what we talked about with the heuristics for vision, where we see continuation of a line in the straightest plane. We segregate frequencies based on similarity. We segregate frequencies based on similarity. So here you have alternating, again, high-low frequencies, which are able to segregate those out into a high melody and a low melody. And the closer those things are in time, the easier it gets to segregate those out. So we'll see if I can play this second one. Which I can't. There we go. So the closer those things are in time, the easier it is to segregate out the high frequencies and low frequencies into separate auditory streams. And then finally, we have memories associated with these things so that we can identify these sounds. And so here are 3 different clips. Who knows what that melody is? Any guesses? Nobody? So if I tell you that it's 3 Blind Mice, is that, no, y'all don't know 3 Blind Mice. No one ever took piano when they were in 2nd grade and had to learn 3 Blind Mice. So that's 3 Blind Mice, and then let's see if you can get the second clip. So 3 Blind Mice, what about this? Mary had a little lamb, right? And the timing's a little bit off because we're keeping the temporal sequencing the same, whereas with these melody schemas, temporal changes matter, right? Temporal changes matter. So we have 3 Blind Mice and Mary had a little lamb. And if we now, 2 things that are pretty recognizable, especially once you know what they are, right? But if we then play the notes, every other note, it's possible for you to segregate that, right? Because the frequencies are the same, where the temporal sequencing is mixed up together. And so even though those two melodies exist within that auditory stimulus, it becomes a unique melody schema because we lack the heuristics in order to detect those two. All right.
I want to talk about the shepherd tone. It's a sound made out of multiple sine waves that play a trick on us. See, what they do is continuously rise in pitch, and then every so often one of them drops down an octave. But our brains don't perceive that because the other two continue rising and cover for it. The sine waves take turns dropping down an octave, producing a sonic barber pole, a noise that appears to keep rising in pitch forever and ever without ever actually going anywhere.
So this is an auditory illusion where, because that one tone
this week by FallingFalling.com, a creation of internet artist New Raphael, where the shepherd forever and ever without ever actually going anywhere.
because the one tone drops down, we don't detect that. It's masked by the other rising tones.
I was reminded of it this week by FallingFalling.com, a creation of internet artist New Raphael, where the shepherd tone seems to go down and fall forever. Raphael also made some other cool sites like OutInTheWind.com. Here, there's nothing except for this menacing wind that slowly erodes the cursor. Okay, now some of you may already know this, but in America, we say Adidas, whereas the rest of the world says Adidas. And no, it does not stand for All Day I Dream About Soccer. That's just a backronym. An acronym made up for a word that already exists.
All right, so I'll play this just because I find it interesting. But I want to go back to the shepherd tone, where we talk about masking in an auditory illusion, where you can have infinitely what seems like it's always increasing and it never reaches the peak, and the opposite effect, if we reverse that, then you can have a falling tone that never reaches it. All right, so we'll listen to Adidas and Adidas.
Instead, it's named after a person, which is why people pronounce it Adidas. It's named after Adi Dassler, a German guy who got in a fight with his brother, so his brother Rudolph went across the river and started his own athletic company known as Puma. That's right, Adidas and Puma came from the same town, from the same family.
All right, so that's my trivia point for you today. So you learn where Adidas or Adidas and Puma come from. All right, so that wraps up hearing in the environment. We will talk about speech and language production on Tuesday. On next Thursday, we will cover the vestibular system, and then you have your final exam on the following Tuesday. So make sure that you've gotten all this auditory stuff, work on that some this weekend, get all that cemented in your long-term memory, consolidated, and we're right here at the end, all right? So you guys get some extra time today.